the hardest battles are fought in the mind. No one can attest to this more than Senua, a Pict warrior from an island in Orkney who's been fighting a war within her head for almost her entire life. A war of darkness and fire, of madness and soundness, of a tragic past and an unknown future. And this war will take her to the gates of her own personal Helheim. Before we cover her story proper, we should first get introduced to the people and culture of the setting. It'll be brief, I promise. Senua was a member of the Picts, an ancient confederation of tribes inhabiting northern Scotland during Roman times. Early Picts are presumed to have been practicing a form of Celtic polytheism, believing and worshipping in a host of gods. The Picts were given their name by the Romans, who looked upon them as pictorial, likely due to the fact that they were mostly nude. They are often said to have tattooed themselves, but there is no evidence to support this claim. The etymology behind their namesake would explain this misconception, as the Latin word picti is taken to mean painted or tattooed people. Senua's design actually embraces the idea that Pict warriors coated themselves in paint, as she too wears war paint, opting for a William Wallace shade of blue. While the Romans expanded their empire through all of Europe, they encountered a particularly formidable group of Celts who refused to yield. To protect themselves from the Picts, whom they considered to be barbarians, the Romans built Hadrian's Wall, a massive fortification which spanned across Britannia. Almost 6 centuries later, and we come to the Viking Age. This period of colonization by Scandinavian raiders brought about great changes to both Britain and Ireland. Orkney, an archipelago of islands located off the tip of Scotland, was inherited by the Picts, and the Vikings would eventually land there. A power struggle ensued, and for centuries the Norsemen and Pictish would fight and kill each other over the territory. The Vikings were legendarily cruel, often offering high-ranking members of tribes to their gods. One method of sacrifice was called the Blood Eagle. We won't discuss it now, but remember this, for it plays a role in the story of Hellblade. Sadly, by 1200 AD, the Vikings had wiped out most of the Pictish peoples. Interestingly, the timetable for Hellblade is quite murky. Senua and her tribe are noted to be Celts and under Northman invasion, yet the Viking Age didn't officially start until 793 AD, and by that time the region was supposed to have been Christianized. We're looking at a window of about 100 years here. It's nothing egregious, and it ultimately has no bearing on the story, but it does make estimating a date challenging. Okay, with that preamble out of the way, the story. Senua, a Pictish girl from Orkney, is born to Galena, a priestess and a healer, and Zimbel, a druid who is a staunch believer in the gods. Unbeknownst to Senua, she suffers from a form of psychosis which manifests itself in a myriad of ways.
When she was younger, she would lay in the grass and stare at the clouds. And as she saw them, elusive, shifting faces. After a while, she could see the faces everywhere. In the trees, the mountains, caves.
Psychosis is a severe mental disorder in which thought and emotions are impaired so much that contact is lost with reality. Mental illnesses of all types have been stigmatized and misunderstood throughout the ages. Yet, surprisingly, the Celts had a nuanced perspective on mental illness. They had 2 words to describe it: guilt and Druth. We'll go into further details about these shortly. Senua could see faces that weren't there, an ailment which she actually shared with her mother. Galena called it the sight. She tried to explain to Senua that it wasn't something to fear, but to look upon with favor. To her, the sight was a gift. Galena believed it allowed them to see into the underworld, and that the underworld and all the souls within could see them back. In contrast, Zimbel saw the sight as a curse, a result of her doubting the gods and allowing herself to be infected by the darkness. To him, his daughter and wife were in need of a cleansing. Galena's condition eventually worsened, likely caused by Zimbel, with the voices in her head growing louder and more overwhelming. She desperately wanted to help them, but her husband thought it best to silence them. When she was 5, Senua's mother committed suicide to escape the darkness and join the gods. Or so Senua tells herself. In reality, Zimbel offered Galena to the pyre to appease the gods, cleanse her of the darkness, and cleanse the village of her supposed taint. Zimbel was a monster, not just to his family, but to others as well. if players find all the lore stones scattered throughout Helheim, it is revealed that a man cloaked in black sold his own people to the Northmen in hopes of safe passage. While it's never explicitly stated, this is likely referring to Zinbel, who we also see cloaked in black. The years that followed were hard on Senua. Her psychosis worsened, which resulted with the memory of her mother's sacrifice being repressed. The voices in her head, which she called the Furies, grew louder and greater in number. All the while, Zinbel continued to subject her to rituals designed to purify her. He would also lock Senua in her room at night. There, the faces she had feared revealed themselves to her, twisting in the dark. And so, life went on, and Senua with it, until one fateful day.
There he was, the lone figure of a boy.
He's there, under the tree.
Swordplay under the shade of a tree. She remembers the first time she saw him. To her young eyes, he moved as if dancing, and the world danced with him. The gloom lifted, and for the first time in years, she felt a ray of hope. Day after day, watching from afar, she mimicked him, perfecting her own secret dance, wishing those fleeting moments of light would stretch out to last forever.
Dillion saw Senua training. He approached her, speaking highly of her skill, and was astounded to learn that she had developed her swordsmanship by studying and mimicking him from afar. Dillion encouraged her to become a warrior. They would eventually befriend each other, and that friendship one day grew into love. Senua wanted to stay with him, as Dillion had the uncanny ability to lift her from the depths of her darkness. Zinbel, however, continued to physically and mentally abuse Senua. He tried to fix her with his rituals, locking her away in a pit. Her resolve to be with Dillion was greater than her fear of her father, of the darkness. He was a tender flame in a pitch-black world, but she was caught between him and Zinbel. Dillion cared little for the notions of the underworld and looked dimly upon her father and his druids. He took after his own father, who believed in nothing the eye couldn't see. Through Dillion, Senua felt the darkness loosen its grip around her, and so she wanted to be with him for good. With Dillion's help, she passed the warrior trials. Senua was at long last ready to leave the past behind and become a warrior in Dillion's clan. She approached her father, intent on telling him her plans to leave. He responded as one would expect.
Father? I'm leaving. I've decided. I think it will be good for me.
It's the darkness. It's speaking through
No,
you.
Dad, it's me. I think I can beat it. In my own way.
I can see the darkness in your eyes, child.
I met a boy.
Boy.
The chief said so.
No.
He said he could help me.
It's a trick.
He said I could be normal.
Normal.
Yes.
No boy is going to save you. No one can. When they see the rot growing inside you,
No!
they will turn their back on you. The gods can only fix you through my hand. You're going nowhere.
No.
You will not defy the gods. Come, child, take my hand. Come. Senua.
No! I am leaving!
You cannot escape the darkness. Your curse will make everyone suffer. You will have blood on your hands!
And so, for a time, they were together, and it was good. Until one warm spring day, when she went to the river with Dillion and the others.
She could taste the rot, but no one else could. She knew something was wrong, something sinister. She begged them to leave, but they just laughed at her. But soon enough, as the bodies piled up, no one was laughing. And they knew that she was not like them.
A plague broke out in the village, something in the water. Many died, and the villagers blamed Senua, a scene which is represented during the Labyrinth trial. Senua blamed herself, questioning whether her father was right about her. Was she cursed? Dillion tried to convince her otherwise, but when his own father died of sickness as well, Senua began to lose all sense of self. In the wake of the plague, Senua was tempted by suicide, but Dillion was there to talk her down. Yet the darkness returned, stronger than ever, twisting her perceptions. It turned her home into a foreign land and made strangers of her neighbors. Senua had to make a choice. She lied in bed with her beloved, apologizing for a darkness which she had no control over, a darkness which blighted all that she cared for. Dillion implored her to let him help her, that the burden wasn't hers alone. Yet Senua refused to accept it, believing her curse would infect him. To Senua, the fight was hers and hers alone. Dillion, ever her pillar of strength, remained steadfast in his belief of her. He made her promise that she would one day return to him. Senua would honor his request, both in heart and deed. But before that would happen, she'd have to contend with the darkness. And in Dillion's words, the hardest battles are fought in the mind. Senua left home in exile. Gelt, as mentioned earlier, is a term the Celts use to describe mental illness. The word is Old Irish, meaning he who goes mad from terror. It has other meanings as well. A panic-stricken fugitive from battle, a crazy person living in the woods who, weirdly enough, is endowed with the power of levitation. While definitions may vary, they're based around the notion of trauma and grief, which would explain Senua's situation perfectly. And thus, Senua became Gelt. Senua's love for Dillion proved to be a bulwark, keeping the madness at bay. She wished to keep her promise, but no matter how hard she tried, she struggled, the darkness proving overwhelming. Senua needed guidance, and she would find it in a kindred spirit, in a Gelt, much like herself. However, while her exile was self-imposed, his was forced upon him. Enter Druth. The narrator called him a troubled man, a scholar turned slave. He had come from Erin, where he once followed his own gods, the Tuatha De Danann. He claimed it was the Northmen who gave him the name Druth, as they saw him as a liar and an old fool. But the name was actually self-adopted, being symbolic of his own darkness and cowardice. While the Gelt is a man or woman driven mad by curse or trauma, Druth is considerably less flattering. Like with Gelt, the word has many meanings: fool, imbecile, a person not responsible for his actions, and one who utters the words of God. Hellblade's writer, Tamim Antionade, paraphrases it as a mad sinner who flees in exile and takes on a beastly nature, growing feathers on his body. The man who called himself Druth once had another name. Findan was a Gaelic scholar. The Vikings invaded his land, and his ability to speak his tongue and their own was the only thing which stayed their blade. Instead of killing him, the Northmen enslaved him and burned his home. He traveled with them, witnessing their brutality as they offered human sacrifices to the fire god Surt. Findan prayed to the gods for mercy, not just his, but all the gods, even the Northmen's, and none answered. He had to do terrible things to survive. Under torture, he led the Northmen to the treasures and slaves they sought. In the face of unfettered brutality, he abandoned his gods, and in the end, salvation was his to find and his alone. He spent 6 years enslaved in what he called hell, but he watched the Northmen, learned their ways. He also learned their fears, as it seemed the Northmen were terrified of Surt's fire, and he used this knowledge to help him escape from them His slave masters landed on the shores of Orkney, burning all before them. During a raid, Findan seized an opportunity. He fled into the fire in confusion, escaping his captors. But he was a changed man, traumatized and shell-shocked. Findan was reborn as Druth. This is when Senua and Druth's paths converged. According to the narrator, it's unknown how long he lasted. His burns were bad, but Senua remembered him with fondness, calling him an old friend. During their time together, he shared tales of the Northmen, of their legends, giving life to their myths. Druth also taught Senua to focus, which helped her see that as much as the darkness had trapped her, she too had trapped it. And he tried to embolden Senua to line her soul with steel. Druth believed that hell would not give her the answer she sought. But she shouldn't look away from the horrors it did offer, because she could not hope to overcome suffering if she refused to look at it. Druth promised to help Senua in life and in death. He died a free man, leaving this mortal coil comforted by the knowledge that Senua would carry his stories with her. Senua inherited an iron mirror he had in his possession. In an interview with Game Informer, the writer said the mirrors were considered magical. They weren't made of glass and silver like the mirrors you get now. They were made of polished iron, so they were really rough and the reflections were ambiguous. Druids used them to see into the underworld. It's based on a real Celtic mirror. Ambiguous reflections and a window into the underworld? Sounds remarkably similar to Senua's darkness. Sometime afterwards, Senua became lost in the wilds. Unbeknownst to her, she had fallen prey to Valravn, the god of illusion. Yet even in death, Druth helped her. In the dark night of her soul, Senua remembered the lessons he taught her. Using the iron mirror, she saw the face of her fear and dispelled Valravn's illusions. The god fled, and the girl lived on. On a side note, Valravn is actually not a Norse deity, but a creature from Danish folklore. It is a supernatural raven created from ravens supping on the flesh of slain warriors, and is capable of taking the form of a knight after consuming the heart of a child. In another equally suitable account, a Valravn is described as a restless soul in search of redemption that flies by night and never day, and can only free itself from its animal continence by consuming the blood of a child. Senua was victorious. Feeling as if she had triumphed over the darkness, she was ready to return home to Dillion. But a wise fool once said, "For every battle won, a greater battle takes its place, and so it goes until we fall."
Dillion!
In this waking nightmare, where all dreams come true, you searched for control, a way to pull through. When you were in love, you left him in tears, to smother your furies and banish your fears. But in darkness they came, through stormy black seas they raided these shores. Do you still hear his screams? And now that you're home, he's so far away. They've taken his soul. To these gods you cannot pray. They can break you, but not your promise. Even death won't keep you apart. Through his darkness you will find him. In your sword still beats a heart. You fought for love unspoilt by your darkness within. You fought for your dreams. Now there's no way to win. In the head of his corpse lies the seat of his soul. So you must carry his vessel to bring him back home.
No!
In her absence, her village had been raided by the Northmen. While some of the villagers lived on as slaves, most were slain. None more brutally than Dillion, who was sacrificed to the Northmen's god, Hela, as a blood eagle. This ritualistic method of execution involved severing the ribs from the spine and pulling the lungs through the opening to create what resembled wings. Senua, broken and desperate, endured the Furies who blamed her for the murder of the man she loved. New voices appeared, joining the chorus. It's easy to imagine that these new ones were probably less friendly than the others. Though the Northmen's brutality broke Senua's spirit, they could not break her promise. Armed with the knowledge of Druth's tales, Senua was ready to go to war with the forces of Hell, vowing to save Dillion's soul. Taking his head, the seat of his soul, she journeyed into the land of mist and fog with the memory of Druth acting as a Virgil to her Dante. Beyond the shoreline is Helheim, accessible only by crossing the bridge which spans the River of Knives. The narrator explained that the gate to Helheim divides the living from the dead, but to cross it, Senua must first open the door which towers before it. It is adorned with the face of the half-rotten goddess Hela. It is she who ruled over the realm of Helheim, and it is she Senua must appeal to if she wished to save Dillion's soul. The door could only be opened by spilling the blood of the gods who guarded it, the god of illusion Valravn, and the god of fire, Surt, two entities of significant import to the Gelts of Hellblade. Senua triumphed over both and opened the gate leading to the bridge, which, if you think about it, should raise a flag. Throughout the story, it's asserted numerous times over that only the dead may cross the bridge to Helheim. Senua should be no exception. So why is it that she can cross it? Probably because she's already dead, metaphorically speaking. Consider this. When opening the first of Surt's gates, Druth himself stated, "The path to Helheim is sealed to the living. You already walk amongst the dead. Look toward the gate, and you will see that it is opened." He also said, "When you see a fire gate of Surt, you know that only a sacrifice will stoke the fires of Muspel and let the dead walk through." Additionally, the narrator asks the player, "Have you ever died before?" When the illusion of self is shattered, you simply cease to be. Senua has died 3 times before, and she will do so again. The 3 deaths in question are 1. The burning of her mother, 2. The ritualistic sacrifice of Dillion, and 3. Her death outside the gate to Helheim. Not a physical death, mind you, but a death of the self, which is what allowed her to cross into the realm of the dead. And according to the narrator, she will die at least once more. Hellblade has an unreliable narrator in Senua, so it's not known how much of it is literal or psychological. While I won't make any concrete proclamations, it's important to note that in the Hellblade documentary, Senua's Psychosis, the writer described the events of the game as a vision quest into Viking territory. So it's likely that the nightmarish aspects of the game, from the Northmen of Hell to the River of Blood, take place at least partially in Senua's head. The same with her showdown with Hela. If Senua was to confront the goddess, she would need to arm herself with a weapon capable of slaying a god. Luckily for her, the mythical sword Gramr, which was forged by Odin and used by Sigurd to slay the dragon Fafnir, was embedded in the hollow of a charnel tree. In order to wield it, she would first need to reforge it by subjecting herself to the trials of Odin, which, of course, drew from her life experiences and aspects of her psychosis. The Labyrinth Shard is about focusing, requiring Senua to block out the voices of the Furies which obstruct her ability to see and think clearly. The Tower Shard was about distinguishing fact from fiction in a world of light and darkness. The Swamp Shard was about sickness, drawing parallels between the plague which ravaged her village and the feverish paranoia which swept through the village in the wake of that plague. And the Blindness Shard was about conquering Senua's fear of her inner darkness. With Dillion as her beacon, Senua passed the trials of Odin, which actually mirrored how he helped her pass the warrior trials. With the sword reforged, she now stood a chance at defeating Hela, but she would have to leave the Furies behind if she hoped to be victorious, as they were an aspect of the psychosis she struggled to overcome. Leaving them behind allowed Senua to act of her own free will, unclouded by their dissonance. To win the war within the self would first need to be harmonious. The final battle with the ruler of Helheim is actually fairly interesting. It isn't a one-on-one showdown, but a war of attrition against a horde of enemies she had already bested. She had already defeated Surt, Valravn and the endless hordes of hellish Northmen. But those victories were ephemeral. To the afflicted mind, the battle is never over. Every obstacle, every monster is replaced by another. The final battle feels appropriately inward, as it reinforces the endless nature of the struggle. Coupled with the shadow of her father who chastised her every step of the way, the final encounter feels incredibly poignant. In the end, Senua finally understood that she couldn't fight the darkness. Her supposed death here isn't literal, it's her acknowledging that the darkness is a part of who she is. The half-rotten goddess becoming Senua is representative that she is the source of her own hell. Therefore, she is Hela. Her vision of Dillion, the man who saw beauty in her darkness, reasserts this dichotomy. The hardest battles are fought in the mind. We are our own worst enemies, but once this is accepted, we can persevere. The ending sees Senua fresh after another death yet still standing, just as the narrator predicted. The Furies return, further establishing that mental illness isn't something that can be cured, but accepted. Senua, a half-rotten goddess of her own make, finally does so. The darkness which tainted her arm recedes, but a lifelong battle still awaits her. She invites us to follow, for she has another story to tell. Where it takes her is anyone's guess. But here's hoping this death will be her last.